Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, October 7th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about the Democratic Party's voter registration edge now shrinking in a number of key battleground states. As you can tell from the graphic on your screen, the states of Pennsylvania, Florida, and North Carolina are states where we are seeing the Democratic Party reduce in their advantage over the Republican Party in terms of overall party registration. If you've studied American politics or you've taken a high school civics course, you might remember that there are more registered Democrats than there are of any other type of affiliation across the nation. The problem for the Democratic Party in many instances is turnout. Thus, the standard rule of thumb that if turnout is high, the Democratic Party tends to do better, and if turnout is low, the Republican Party tends to do better. A perfect example of that would be the 2014 and 2018 midterm elections. In the 2018 midterm elections, the Democratic Party did very well in the House of Representatives. I understand that the enthusiasm there was on the side of the Democratic Party, but then again, you also have to realize that considering that there was lack of enthusiasm in 2014, that can contribute to the overall lack of turnout across the nation. The Republican Party has one thing going for them, that they vote nearly all the time in every instance, whether it's a special election, it's a House election, midterm election, crucial Senate races, presidential elections. Republicans tend to turn out at a higher level when it comes down to averaging every single type of election. For Democrats, that simply isn't the case. So like I was talking about 2014, 2018, the voter turnout in 2018 rivaled the 2012-2008 presidential election in terms of overall votes cast. In addition, when you take a look at the percentage, over 50% of the nation turned out to vote in the 2018 midterm elections. So that was a very substantial and a very notable year for the Democratic Party, because with turnout increasing by such a significant amount relative to the last midterm, in which turnout was nearly 40%, that was a very significant uptick and could likely explain the overall change in support on the same exact House map from 2014. But going back to what we are talking about today, we are talking about voter registration. And voter registration, while not necessarily a perfect indicator of how states might be going, but can give us a general idea. Because if people are changing their party affiliations from Democrat to Republican or Democrat to Independent, largely this can be due to the fact that they no longer affiliate, no longer align with the values of the Democratic Party, and could spell out some warning signs for the Democrats. Because when you take a look at some of these states, they should not be seeing reductions in Democratic voter registration. Republicans should not be seeing significant increases. As we do stand today, the American political system is very polarized, and of course, there is always going to be that division. But it's clear that with this rapid reduction in the amount of Democratic voter registration, or the advantage that Democrats have over Republicans, that the Republican Party clearly is doing some things better than the Democratic Party. And I think it also has to do a lot with COVID-19 guidelines. We'll get into that in just a moment. I thought that was a very interesting point back in the 2020 election, and I think it is absolutely valid. But they start off this article talking about the state of Pennsylvania, saying that the Democrats now lead Republicans in voter registration by over 500,000 people, 632,000 people. But this is down from where it was 2 years ago, 2019. 813,000 advantage for the Democratic Party. This is a very big reduction. In the state of North Carolina, the Democratic Party's advantage has shrunk by more than 140,000 registered voters since October of 2018. That is why this is so interesting. I mean, looking at the fewer active registered voters, Democratic voters in North Carolina than there were 6 years ago is very notable, because Democrats have been trying to ensure that these states remain in their column or switch over to their column, but it's going to be more difficult with less and less voters across the ground. This also can be applied to the state of Florida. It says it's the nation's largest and most volatile swing state. I wouldn't necessarily agree with the largest characterization, but in terms of true swing states, meaning they have voted for Democrats and Republicans in the 21st century, I guess Florida does earn that characterization. But the Democratic Party advantage over Republicans has shrunk by over 200,000 over the past 2 years. It says that Democrats only take the advantage over the Republican Party by just 24,000 voters. 2019, I mean, that was after 2018, in which Democrats didn't even win the Senate election in the state of Florida. They didn't win the governor election. They lost it by less than half a percentage point for both. So when you see that, and you see that the reduction in support has been pretty significant, combined with the fact that Donald Trump has improved his margin of victory relative to where it was back in 2016, you have to ask, what is this voter registration telling us? And if it already indicated that Florida was going to shift to the right, and it did, what does this say about other states? But they also They also point out the silver linings for Democrats here in the state of Arizona, where it has actually gotten more evenly split amongst recent voters. But Democrats still lag Republicans in voter registration. Looking at a lot of these states, of course, there are some anomalies, but the point is that in these key states, North Carolina, Florida, and Pennsylvania, which just so happen to be very crucial states for the upcoming Senate elections, it makes it increasingly more daunting for the Democratic Party to retain control of the United States Senate, and I think that it definitely should. And like I was mentioning earlier, when it comes down to COVID-19 restrictions, I want you to think about it for a moment. Let's go ahead and take a look at the 2020 election, because I think that is certainly a fair point of interest. Let me characterize all of the states that are up in this election, and then just keep the three that see a GOP improvement. But we are going to go back to the 2020 presidential election, and I bring this up for a reason. When you take a look at the overall shifts across the United States, you might notice that the state of Florida has some pretty notable ones to the right. Miami-Dade County is probably the most notable, in which it got 22 points more Republican than 2016. I want you to compare and contrast the methods utilized in a state such as Florida, with Governor Ron DeSantis, who really was very lackadaisical when it comes down to COVID-19 restrictions, when it comes down to a number of other endeavors in order to prevent the transmission of the virus itself. And it seems as if that the Democratic Party didn't really listen to the lack of protocols, the lack of preventive measures put forth by Ron DeSantis. The Democratic Party tried to play it safe when it comes down to COVID-19. A lot of states prohibited in-person door knocking. I know in my home state of Maryland, the Democratic Party refused to knock on a single door during the entire election cycle. Obviously, it doesn't matter in a state such as Maryland, which is already lopsided to the left by over 30 points, but it certainly matters in a state such as Florida. And the Republican Party in 2020 also held voter registration drives, which I thought was just very interesting. Voter registration drives in the middle of a pandemic, sure, you look down upon it, but if everyone gets through it safely and people end up registering for the Republican Party, that's when it goes into the benefit. And what I see from the results in the state of Florida is that something clearly worked. When the Republican Party went into there and they said that they were going to move this state towards the right, they weren't kidding. I mean, this has been a calculated and orchestrated event over the past 20 years, probably longer, in which the Republican Party seized control of the governorship, seized control of the state legislature, redrew these House districts in such a beneficial way, and made it so, no matter where you look in Florida, as much as Democrats would love for it to be considered to be, truly battleground state, which it definitely is a swing state, but does lean towards the right, especially relative to the rest of the nation. The Republican Party has just made so many advancements that it makes it so much more difficult, I would say, for the Democratic Party to try to maintain this voter registration advantage. And considering that the Republican Party had practically an extra 2 years of campaigning in person, had practically an extra 2 years, continuing through now, of voter registration drives in person, a full year during an election cycle where voter turnout was the highest for the first time since 1900. I kid you not the century, but the actual year 1900, highest turnout in 120 years in this American electorate. But the point is that states such as Florida and North Carolina and Pennsylvania, where the Democratic Party might have been hands off when it comes down to voter registration drives, when it comes down to door knocking, canvassing efforts, that's why I think largely the Republican Party was able to gain so many more registered voters over the past year. Because Democrats are still trying to play it safe when it comes down to a lot of these states. While North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Florida don't exactly have the most restrictive measures when it comes down to COVID-19, the Democratic Party will enact their own versions of it and will follow the CDC guidelines in the way that maybe members of the Republican Party might not, because they didn't back in 2020. And I think that they certainly wouldn't when the virus has gotten in a better position for the American public and people are able to get vaccinated. But the point is that the Democratic Party, largely because they wanted to play safer when it comes down to the vaccine, when it comes down to COVID-19, was to their detriment in the overall finalized map. And of course, I don't even think that the Democratic Party should have been doing these in-person voter registration drives, but you do have to acknowledge that there was some type of negative implication by them playing it safe. I understand public health should always come first, and I think that was the best position that could have been taken by campaigns in both political parties. Obviously, one adhered to it more than the other. I just think that public health amidst a pandemic was way more important than this type of voter registration gains. But now that it is nearly said and done in a number of states where restrictions are fully lifted, everything is back to normal, even if the virus is still ravaging across the nation, you are looking at a voter deficit here that the Democratic Party seems to have not been able to continue. And I think that will prove to be to their detriment back up in 2022 and 2024. But this isn't something that's actually super new. I think that voter registration, you can take a look at trends over years where you are starting to see what the political verse would call ancestral Democrats. Now, what does that exactly mean? Well, you need to understand the way that states voted in the past. Let's go to the 2000 presidential election. This is an election where you look at it from face value and you see a lot of red. In fact, I can show you a way to make it being viewed at face value just by changing the lean, the likely, and the lean, likely, and safe all to the same margin. And this is what you would see. All of these states, or actually, I did this the wrong way. I would have to make it all one point where you can just see the overall characterization and it would provide more context, or less context, actually. And that's the good part of it. So with everything equal to 1, you can see just how solid this country is. I mean, it seems as if there is this red wave across the nation, Republicans winning in Ohio, Colorado, Arizona, Georgia, all states that the Democrats won in the 2020 election. But when you expand into the margins, that's when this gets very interesting. You see, even though there might have been a victory for the Republican Party in Texas by 21 points, the state of Louisiana was only won by 7 points. The state of Arkansas was only won by 5 points. The state of Tennessee was won by 4 points. These are states that all voted for Donald Trump by well over 20 points in both 2016 and 2020. And that's why this is so notable. Because Texas, Tennessee, Arkansas, Louisiana, those 3 in Texas moved in opposite directions relative to 2000. But the point is that they both seemed red. But there were a lot more Democratic supporters in Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Missouri even. Alabama, which was only won by George W. Bush by, get this, 14.9%. Alabama, which is largely stereotyped as one of the most Republican states in the nation, only went to George W. Bush by 14.9%. I mean, I kid you not. This is a state that is just nearly as competitive as Colorado was in the 2020 election, to put that into perspective. So when you see Alabama in this place, when you see Tennessee, when you see Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri, these are the ancestral Democrats that might have identified as Democrats before, and thus narrowed up races such as this one, because in 92 and 96, I mean, they solidly supported Bill Clinton. You can see the margins here were very solid for the Democratic nominee. But now they are changing their party registration. So I think overall, this is a combined effort of ancestral Democrats that were Democrats in the past that maybe stuck it out for people such as Joe Manchin. Maybe that could be an example. Joe Manchin, I mean, was someone who resembles what used to be a lot of Democrats. Democrats actually controlled the state legislature in the state of Kentucky up until 2015. Looking at the West Virginia Senate race in 2018, it went to a Democrat. And Joe Manchin would be one of those Democrats that we view now as sort of ancestral Democrats. He may be just a little bit more left-leaning, considering he's in a much more national position than many of these other Democrats. But the point being that a lot of these Democrats of the past are no longer Democrats today. I think another point of interest would be pointing out the 2009 60-40 majority for the Democratic Party. I personally do not think they could have passed the stimulus checks that passed earlier on in this year. The Democratic Party of today is much more left-leaning and much more liberal than they were back then. And many of those Democrats might identify as Republicans today. And if that is something that could have happened, as we saw actually with the Republican Revolution in 94, in which many previous Democrats switched over to the Republican Party, we are starting to see that happen yet again. So there is no one real reason as to why Democrats are lagging behind when it comes down to this voter registration pace that the GOP is clearly outpacing them with. But it also is something that they should look to as means for improvement. The Democratic Party probably won't be losing as many voters as they lose in terms of registered voters. I can guarantee you that many of those people that decided to switch from Democrat to Independent or Democrat to Republican or just registered as Republican for the first time, many of them were never going to vote for Democrats in our modern era or haven't voted for Democrats in potentially decades. And that is a very real possibility. There are plenty of registered Democrats in Arkansas that did not vote for a Democrat since Bill Clinton, but still might keep their party registration, one, because they don't want to change it, or two, because they simply just don't feel that it's necessary. Party registration doesn't have any type of binding, especially when you live in an open primary state. It really doesn't matter. And some states don't even do party registration. For instance, you can look at Virginia, which doesn't even characterize it at all. So what we should take away from this is that Democrats, yes, should look at this as a means for the possibility of losing an election. That it might mean that Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Florida could all shift away from them relative to 2020. But they also should be not so worried and not so panicked that they should assume that this means that they're losing significant amounts of support. Yes, at face value, Republicans gaining in terms of voter registration obviously looks better for them and will likely narrowly improve their margins if they are to win or narrowly narrow up some of these states. But it is not the end of discussion. It is not the end-all be-all now that we have seen a rapid increase in Republican registration, or a rapid decrease of a Democratic Party advantage over the Republican Party. There are so many factors that can tie into it, and it's not just a perfect science. It's not just one thing that we can use to pinpoint the reason why. There are a number of issues. I think I hit the two most important ones. Talking about voter registration drives and outreach to voters, especially during the pandemic. One party was much more on the grounds, and we know this from studies that people do not answer the phone as much as they answer their door. You are much more inclined to agree with someone and to move along with them down a voting process, XYZ, whatever it might be, in person than you are on the phone. You can easily hang up. You can't easily shut the door in someone's face. And during a pandemic, only one party was willing to actually go down and hold these drives and hold these efforts in order to reach out to people on the ground. Number two, in terms of ancestral Democrats, they are moving away. These people that might have been Democrats in Kentucky, West Virginia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Bill Clinton Democrats, the Jimmy Carter Democrats, no longer Democrats in today's day and age because they don't align with the Democratic Party. I'm sure there's a lot of them. Obviously, a lot of people that voted for Clinton that also ended up voting for Biden in 2020. That is the majority of the Democratic Party. But there are certainly some people out there that might be inclined to switch over to the GOP, especially if they start to see themselves resonate with Donald Trump more than they do other types of candidates. And that can certainly start to see why the party registration begins to change. So that wraps up this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.